There was a time before we walked on the moon, or built outposts in space, or sent our robot emissaries to explore the planets. A time when the first images of our not-too-distant future came from science fiction literature and movies, including one very special movie. In the spring of 1968, 2001 lay in the far distant future, where it was enjoyed by millions on the biggest screens imaginable. 15 months before astronauts walked on the moon, movie audiences were taking an amazingly prophetic journey through time and space, courtesy of a science fiction writer named Arthur C. Clarke and producer, co-writer, and director Stanley Kubrick.
I mean, I was profoundly affected by 2001. Kubrick was doing something that no one else had done before, and no one else has done since, which is to make a movie that's a visual treat. It's a feast. It's a symphony. It unfolds in the way music unfolds. It can be seen over and over the way music can be heard over and over.
It was so real you could touch it and taste it and smell it. It told me that we're doing the right thing.
I watched it in a cluster of science fiction fans, and we were all blown away. We loved it. I think I've seen it 4 times.
I've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey 25 times on the big screen, and it's a different experience for me each time. The world is a different place, and the film responds to the changing of the times.
Arriving in theaters just as the first age of manned spaceflight was nearing its climax, 2001 showed us a very plausible near future while exploring some of our oldest and most profound questions. The story of 2001 begins on the African veldt nearly 4 million years ago. Our ancestors, still a long way from anyone we might recognize, were trying to adapt to a rapidly changing climate. The sudden arrival of an alien artifact, a huge black monolith, inspires the tribe's leader, a wistful fellow the script calls Moonwatcher, to take action against slow-moving prey and any annoying neighbors. This one small step ensures both a healthy diet and a legacy of conflict that's still flourishing. Humanity was on its way. The story leaps ahead to the year 2001, a few days after a research team has found a second artifact buried on the moon. Exposed to sunlight, the monolith sends a blast of radio energy towards the planet Jupiter. A top-secret mission is quickly dispatched. The voyage of the spacecraft Discovery culminates in an attempt by the ship's computer, HAL 9000, to kill the crew and hijack the mission. Lone survivor David Bowman manages to disable HAL just in time to fly headlong into his own climactic alien encounter, the consequences of which are so far-reaching, their implications are still debated today. The making of 2001 would stretch out over 4 years, beginning at a time already known for big ideas. In 1964, the space race was at its peak. Soviet cosmonauts had racked up nearly 5 times as many hours in space as their American counterparts. NASA was preparing to launch its series of 2-man Gemini flights, which would develop the skills needed for long-duration missions. President Kennedy's massively funded Apollo program was creating the infrastructure to launch voyages to the surface of the moon. It was against this background that director Stanley Kubrick released his Cold War comedy, Dr. Strangelove. His next project would be different, a little more optimistic and a lot more ambitious. Born and raised in New York City, Stanley Kubrick began his career as a freelance photographer. A formidable chess player, he was able to supplement his income with pickup games in Washington Square Park. Shorts and documentary work led to a career as an independent filmmaker. Kubrick produced, co-wrote, and directed 13 feature films between 1953 and his death in 1999. No 2 were alike, but none would ever be mistaken for anything but a Stanley Kubrick film. In choosing a science fiction theme to follow Dr. Strangelove, Kubrick went looking for an epic tale that would let him examine nothing less than humanity's intimate connection with the universe itself. His first and most important step was to contact an acknowledged master of the genre, a man whose literary work had consistently explored those very realms.
This was a man who was considered the leading science fiction writer in the world, and in a very real sense, one of the fathers of modern science fiction. The idea that you could get the absolute best A-team filmmaker and the absolute best A-team science fiction writer to come together and work on a project jointly was just wonderful from the science fiction reader's point of view. This was heaven.
The whole thing started in 1964 when Stanley wrote to me saying that he wanted to do the proverbial good science fiction movie, implying that there hadn't been any up to that time. And did I have any ideas?
As a young engineer, Arthur C. Clarke had been assigned to operate the newly developed British radar systems of World War II. A lifelong interest in space technology would combine with a love for storytelling to make him one of the first and most popular post-war science fiction authors, though future historians will likely honor him equally for his non-literary contributions, including the very means by which you may be viewing this program.
We think of Arthur C. Clarke as a science fiction writer, and he is, but Arthur C. Clarke also is a legitimate scientist. In fact, Clarke created the concept of the geosynchronous orbit, which is a satellite that stays firmly in orbit over one spot on the equator. It's what makes telecommunications satellites possible. If you go 23,000 miles up, a satellite at that altitude and no other altitude will remain over a fixed spot on the ground. This was actually quite a scientific breakthrough, and we still sometimes refer to that orbit as the Clarke orbit because he defined it.
Today, of course, Clarke's communication relays blanket the globe. That's one of the first things you notice when you land in Sri Lanka, where Sir Arthur makes his home, and where his legacy also greets you with unmistakable evidence that you're very near the equator, where all the satellite dishes point straight up.
My original presentation of the communication satellite idea was in a paper I wrote to Wireless World, I think in the spring, and then I developed it into the full article in October of '45. At that time, the war was coming to an end, and we, members of the British Interplanetary Society who had been scattered around the world, we met occasionally, and we were saying, well, how could we make rockets pay for themselves to go to the moon?
The marriage of science fiction literature and film is as old as the movies themselves. In 1902, French film pioneer Georges Méliès created this complex and whimsical tribute to the writings of Jules Verne, the father of modern science fiction, who in 1865 had accurately predicted that the first manned moon flight would take off from the east coast of Florida, carrying a 3-man crew on a 4-day lunar transit. Throughout the 20th century, it seemed that every generation produced its own great epic of space travel, employing the best-known scientists and science fiction authors of the day, and frequently achieving a surprising level of farsightedness. Prior to Kubrick and Clarke, the most recent entry had been this collaboration between producer George Pal and novelist Robert Heinlein. But the genre wouldn't reach its apogee until Stanley Kubrick decided to get in touch with Arthur C. Clarke.
Well, I was going to New York to work with Time Life on a book called Man and Space. So I used this opportunity of meeting Stanley, and we discussed my very short stories, and found 6 which we thought might be used for a space movie. And one by one, we threw them away until we left just the one, the finding of an artifact on the moon. So I bought back my 5, the other 5 from Stanley, and I still have them here. Are you listening, Steven Spielberg?
The earliest inspiration for 2001, Clarke's 1948 short story, The Sentinel, contained the crucial element of the cosmic fire alarm, buried on the moon, patiently awaiting the sunlight that would trigger it when the ape-men of Planet 3 finally took their first real steps. And with that alien broadcast into the void, the original short story ended. In 2001, it was just the beginning.
When I read the screenplay of 2001, there was something that was terribly familiar about it. And it was the section on the finding of the monolith. And then it clicked. When I was, 12, 13, 14, those particular years, I was an avid science fiction fan. And I remember in one of those anthologies reading the short story that inspired 2001, which was called The Sentinel. And I had read that short story and remembered it through all those years. It had that much of an impact on me.
As the work began, Clarke and Kubrick faced a unique challenge: how to design and create a plausible future for moviegoers who would very likely live to see it.
We not only heard it from Arthur C. Clarke, we heard it from Walt Disney and the kinds of programming we'd have on television. We heard it from the 1964 World's Fair in New York, which I grew up in. I used to spend all my time there, going to the General Motors Futurama, the General Electric Carousel of Progress. All of these companies would have their visions of the future.
In fact, apart from helping to showcase our imminent future, the 1964 New York World's Fair would provide Kubrick with the last piece of the puzzle, the final element he needed for the making of 2001.
When you're trying to define what science fiction is, one of the great definitions we use as writers of the printed literature is the science integral to the story? If you take the science out, does the story fall apart? Just as in a mystery story, if you take the crime out, does the story fall apart? That's true for almost every printed work of science fiction. It's not true for most science fiction movies.
It had been agreed early on that Clarke would write the story as a novel, which he and Kubrick would then turn into a screenplay. As Clarke settled down to work at New York's Chelsea Hotel, Kubrick carried on in his now legendary fashion to research everything he could about rocketry, spaceflight, low Earth orbital rendezvous, deep space exploration, and the most promising new designs for way over the horizon interplanetary spacecraft.
He would learn everything about everything. Whatever he was interested in, he would in a week or so, he would know more about it than the top experts on that subject. I mean, he was absolutely amazing that way.
On Clarke's recommendation, Kubrick hired aerospace consultants Fred Ordway and Harry Lange, who began by providing early designs for the spacecraft and flight plans that would lie at the heart of 2001's futuristic visions. As production geared up and designs were finalized, Kubrick and Company faced a new problem. The quality of visual effects available in the early 1960s varied widely, but was generally disappointing. While pondering how best to achieve the level of photorealism he would need, Kubrick came across a short film made by the National Film Board of Canada. Universe was a low-budget documentary that relied on sheer ingenuity and had taken nearly 3 years to complete. Kubrick immediately contacted the film's visual effects supervisor, Wally Gentleman.
He did indeed suck information out, if you like, a sponge, and so much so that after a day of working at the studio, he would call me up at home to ask more questions.
One of the techniques devised by Wally Gentleman for Universe suggested a possible approach for the climax of 2001. By using chemical agents to break the surface tension, paints and other substances could be injected into water over black velvet. Early tests provided MGM executives with some much appreciated evidence that Kubrick knew what he was doing and that the film they were about to invest $10 million in would, at the very least, be nice to look at. Another of Kubrick's early collaborators was a young animator named Douglas Trumbull, who'd recently completed his first professional assignment, helping to create imagery for a film Kubrick had seen at the 1964 World's Fair.
There's a very kind man at an animation studio that I visited with my little portfolio. Said, well, you know, there's this weird place down in Hollywood doing animated space films for the government and World's Fairs and stuff like that, called graphic films. And they might like your portfolio. We don't have a clue what to do with you here because we're doing Mr. Magoo. And so I went down there and met Con Pedersen, who actually came to work on 2001. And I got a job at Graphic Films doing these films, and that one of them was To the Moon and Beyond in a spherical 10-perf Cinerama 360 process for the World's Fair in New York in 1964. And Kubrick saw that film, hired Graphic Films to start doing some preliminary design work for 2001, and I was one of the illustrators working on that preliminary design. And then he moved to England and terminated the contract because he was going to hire artists there. And I found his phone number on the bulletin board and called him up and said, I'm the guy doing these illustrations and I'd love to come over and work for you. And he said, fabulous. So he sent me and my wife a ticket and we went.
By the summer of 1965, as future moonwalkers practiced in low Earth orbit, Stanley Kubrick moved the entire production to England, settling in for the next 2 years at MGM's cavernous Borehamwood Studios, just outside of London. With the screenplay nearing completion, or as near to completion as Kubrick would allow on this constantly evolving project, the visual effects unit also set to work, initially by resurrecting some very old techniques.
It was basically using the animation technique of laying down a cell and working on a flat level under the camera. So the moon bus tracking over the surface of the moon was really a photographic cutout, not a model.
Wally Gentleman would leave the effects unit early in production due to scheduling conflicts back at the National Film Board. Meanwhile, Kubrick's newly formed visual effects unit was quickly realizing that this director's visions were going to require some very different approaches.
See, Kubrick was, in fact, this amazing perfectionist. And you might think from that that means he knows exactly what he wants and he's going to demand a certain kind of thing and get it. Well, that wasn't the case at all. Stanley did not know quite what he wanted. He did know that he would know it when he saw it. But from my experience, he was the greatest teacher and mentor because he let me have rope to experiment. One of the things that Kubrick wanted was this incredible high quality, super, super sharpness. And having been a still photographer, he was interested in exploring strobe photography with strobe lights going off on each frame of film. So each frame was absolutely pristinely sharp and clear and in infinite depth of field, F-32 kind of shots. So all this super tech equipment was brought in, giant strobes, a lot of power supplies and all this stuff. And that was when Kubrick and I, because I discovered that super sharpness is not what you want. Blurring is what you want. Film is all based upon the expectation that a frame of motion is going to blur a little bit while the shutter is open. And that became the style of the film.
2001 begins some 4 million years in the past among a tribe of our Australopithecine ancestors as they teeter on the brink of starvation, trying to scratch a living from the harsh African veldt. The choreographer and key performer in these scenes, shot almost entirely before a large front projection screen in England, recalls a typical day on the job.
Actually, we'd start a couple hours beforehand putting the costumes on. And the dominant thing all the time was how uncomfortable we were, because the costumes were so warm and so uncomfortable. I was always thinking about how am I going to do this shot? How am I going to do this? How am I going to do that? But somehow we were able to do it.
Daniel Richter had worked in England as a dancer and mime before being hired to help create 2001's Dawn of Man sequence. In a movie filled with leaps of human consciousness, this sequence culminated in a depiction of the very earliest, as Richter's character takes the first important step from ape to human.
I knew I was a part of something very important based on that part of the film that I wasn't in. I mean, that happens to be my favorite part of the film, because it's the moment when Stanley was able to capture the moment of the missing link, the moment ape became man. And that to me was, I get chills even today when I think about that moment.
One of the few episodes in 2001 that I can remember seeing film myself, and I wasn't there very often because I was in America much of the time, was Moonwatcher Dan Richter on a platform surrounded by bones and smashing away, and the bones going up in the air. And that was one of the few exterior shots. It was shot outside the studio, and it was rather important the cameraman had the right angle. Otherwise, he'd have shown London buses going by, which would rather spoil the illusion. And perhaps one of the most famous scenes in the movie is when Moonwatcher throws up that bone, and it turns into, actually it's supposed to be an orbiting space weapon, a bomb of some kind in orbit. So the 3 million years of weapon development. But of course that isn't really spelled out in the film, and perhaps no need for it to
When people talk about that famous jump cut, when the Moonwatcher, the Australopithecine, throws the femur up in the air and it turns into something in Earth orbit, most people remember it as turning into the Pan Am space clipper or turning into the space station. It doesn't do that. It turns into an orbiting nuclear weapons platform. What we see is not how far we've leaped ahead. What we see is that today, 2001, and 4 million years ago on the African belt, it's exactly the same. The power of mankind is the power of its weapons. It's a continuation, not a discontinuity in that jump.
2001's famous 4 million year jump cut would propel us into a heavily populated low Earth orbit, one in which nuclear weapons not only have a presence, but in both the early designs for the movie and in a very real project from the era, were actually going to be used to launch us out into deep space.
I always wanted to go up there, and I was an astronaut candidate and wasn't selected to go. But just like any visceral, real experience that one shares, it would be great to have that experience firsthand, to see the Earth from Earth orbit.
In 1968, NASA was ready to go to the moon. So were Kubrick and Clark, though their astronauts would go about it differently. Instead of NASA's plan to carry along a small lunar landing craft, which would rejoin with its mothership in a lunar orbit rendezvous, 2001 would introduce a large, permanent way station in Earth orbit, from which lunar and planetary explorers could embark. Oddly enough, this was exactly the plan which NASA's chief designer, Wernher von Braun, numerous science and science fiction writers, and renowned space illustrator Chesley Bonestell had been proposing since the early 1950s.
Certainly that's a von Braun space station. Go on double because it's fun to consider you might need more room after building the first one.
I mean, the actual vision you saw in 2001 obviously derived from Bonestell and so on, because anybody who was working in those organizations design a future. Well, of course, they'd probably grown up like I had, devouring these pictures, and so obviously it was reflected in what they dreamed about.
Chesley Bonestell was by far a standalone visual artist depicting life in space in the most realistic way. He was kind of the Maxfield Parrish of outer space.
When Stanley Kubrick put the movie together, he tried to interpret Arthur C. Clarke's words. I think he did a nice interpretation, but he had one foot firmly planted in the 50s and his other foot planted in the 21st century.
I still think the best idea for a space station is a rotating wheel, which was the almost traditional space station, if you can use such a term. I'm afraid the International Space Station and Mir and all those look like used car lots.
An element shared by space station designs from the 1950s and 2001's orbital hotel and office complex was the idea of the rotating wheel. With a slow spin to simulate gravity, passengers could live, work, and play along the inner walls.
I'm sure the space hotels will be wheels, and in fact there's a project underway now of collecting or saving the shuttle tanks, which are normally just discarded, and then assembling them in a wheel and setting it moving, and then you could have a fairly cheap, meaning only $100 billion or so, space hotel.
If human beings are going to go into space and take a long-term view, do it strategically. The sensible way is you first build something like a shuttle that is reliable, economical, and robust. You then build a way station, and at that time it was thought that human beings would not survive zero-G for any great length of time, hence the wheel, though every engineer who saw it immediately had a fit and said, you do not spin up a wheel that is not fully built. You know, you have to finish it before you spin it up, otherwise you have real problems.
I think we're 25 years off from 2001. I wish it was happening, but it's not. We need to get to about the third generation reusable launch vehicle. Shuttle's the first. We have a series of vehicles we're developing now, which will be the second reusable launch vehicle, operational by about 2010, 2015, and by 2025, we're going to have a Pan Am Clipper. We're on our way. If you take a look at that orbiting space station, that portal is about half the size of the International Space Station. You know, our International Space Station spans about 300 feet, 350 feet. Well, that portal to me looks to be something on the order of 200 feet. We're beginning to get to that step. So by the time 2025 comes around, I think we'll be on our third generation space station, third generation reusable vehicle. The reality will be there, and I deeply believe it's going to be commercial operations to low Earth orbit. But you noticed, once you left low Earth orbit, you went into NASA-type vehicles. So we're going to get the government out of low Earth orbit, just like 2001 projects, and then we're going to push out into our solar system.
We had quite a problem in planning 2001 because we knew that it would be released when men had either reached the moon or had failed to reach the moon. Either scenario, you know, could affect the reception of the movie.
In 2001, after a short visit to a thriving lunar colony and an eerie meeting with another of those ancient monoliths, 5 human beings and 1 infallible computer set course for the outer solar system, where the real adventure was patiently waiting. With the voyage of the giant spacecraft Discovery to the outer solar system, Kubrick and Clarke really were going where no one had gone before. Despite the many bold and far-sighted ideas that were floating around back then, nobody knew how to design a craft that could carry humans more than 4,000 times farther than the distance from the Earth to the moon, while protecting them from the many dangers that await so far from home. Even today, inspired as they are by Kubrick and Clarke's vision, scientists at NASA still have no real idea just how we would pull this off.
Let me give you just one little example from the movie of the kind of problems you could overcome real easy with the stroke of a pen. We're trying to struggle with how to solve the damage radiation could do once you just leave Earth orbit and just get susceptible to cosmic rays. These guys went to the orbit of Jupiter with radiation that could be on the order of nuclear bombs. So it was very easy. They solved that radiation problem.
At one time back in the early days of the space race, nuclear weapons were seriously considered as a viable power source for outer planet missions. The idea first sprang up among a very keen group of space enthusiasts who regularly got together, quite unofficially, to help plan the future.
My career began as a civil servant in the government audit department. And of course, luckily, that gave me plenty of spare time to work on things that really interested me, which is helping to run the British Interplanetary Society and designing spaceships in His Majesty's time.
The British Interplanetary Society was one of many civilian organizations that sprang up during the 1930s and 40s at a time when it seemed that the technological means to reach space were advancing far more rapidly than individual governments were willing to exploit them. Clarke and his companions engaged in a kind of long-running free-form design exchange, evolving many of the ideas that would make it into 2001, and at least one that nearly left for the stars.
We realized as soon as nuclear energy was released that might be one way of getting away from the Earth. The power was there, the energy was there, the question was to harness it. And some of the first published designs for nuclear propulsion appeared in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society, soon after 1945.
Actual nukes were exploded. I mean, in 1958, two nuclear weapons were exploded in space in the megaton range. I think three megaton or over 3 megaton nuclear weapons.
One of the ideas for how Discovery would be propelled is something that was called the Orion project. You would throw nuclear bombs out the back, explode them against a compression plate, and the ship would move through space with a little sort of putt-putt motion of constant string of exploding nuclear weapons.
Development of a Project Orion nuclear pulsecraft prototype, along with plans for voyages to the outer solar system, carried on throughout the 1950s and early 60s, under the guidance of physicists Theodore Taylor and Freeman Dyson.
Well, it means simply you have about 1,000 nuclear bombs on board, and you have a large ship, and you throw the bombs out one at a time, and they blow you up into space. And of course, the trick is to do that without blowing the ship to pieces. And that's what we thought we'd done.
Basically, you wander off to your quartermaster at Nevada test range. You say, I want a nuke, nothing particularly ostentatious, please. A kiloton or two will do nicely. You put it down in the middle of the desert. You then stick a very large piece of metal over the top. You sit on top of the metal, light the blue touch paper, put your fingers in your ears, and wait. Soon you'll be going up rather quickly. And they actually built a little model, mock-up, of this, which used chemical explosives, and tried it out. You can see it in the Smithsonian today.
As a design, it actually works. And it's sort of a positive use for nuclear weaponry in a way. And this was very much what they had in mind for Discovery.
The trick is you have a very large, heavy pusher plate at the back, which takes the force of the explosions. And the pusher plate then is only connected to the ship by means of long shock absorbers, so that the plate goes jerk, 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 and the shock absorbers smooth that out. So what the ship feels is a steady push. And I think that it does work in principle. But of course we never got the green light actually to go.
I think Stanley felt that after Dr. Strangelove, he didn't want to have anything more to do with nuclear bombs, so he dropped that idea, and I'm very glad we did.
Even with Project Orion mothballed, on film by Kubrick, and in real life by international treaty, Dr. Dyson's world would still converge with 2001. Midway through production, Kubrick decided to ask some working physicists to provide an on-screen introduction to the movie.
I was actually supposed to speak a prologue or something at the beginning, which fortunately was cut out before the thing got shown. It was great fun. I was picked up at London Airport in a limousine, the first time I ever traveled in such splendor, and taken to the set. And so I watched for a whole day while they did an extraordinarily tedious scene with just a single character, I guess. All he had to do was just to walk up and down while this rotating structure simulated the spacecraft, and Kubrick didn't seem to be interested in anything except just the technical gadgets. He was all the time fooling around with the lighting and with the machinery, paid no attention to me or to the actor. Anyway, it was amusing to see how movies actually get done.
The scenes Dr. Dyson witnessed were being painstakingly filmed on the Centrifuge, a slowly rotating set more than 40 feet tall. Inside was built Discovery's central command deck, where gravity could be simulated through centrifugal force. The massive and dangerous set was constructed by British aircraft company Vickers Engineering at a cost of nearly 10% of the movie's budget. Actors and camera operators spent many weeks strapped firmly in place in order to capture imagery previously unseen on Earth.
It was like one of the major rides at Disneyland. It was like a huge Ferris wheel, several stories high, that actually revolved, and it was quite noisy when it revolved, so we didn't do a lot of, as I remember, there was very little, if ever, a dialogue going. There wasn't much dialogue in the film to begin with.
As Mission Commander David Bowman, actor Keir Dullea had many months to study the style of another legendary commander, the meticulous, contemplative, ultimate perfectionist Stanley Kubrick.
I know I arrived with a lot of awe, and I think for the first week or so, I mean, Stanley told me he had to work on getting rid of that, and one of the first things he did was to sort of kind of scratch his head and say, oh, gosh, Keir, he said things like gosh and gee a lot. He said, you know, you're such an unbelievable actor, and I don't know what it is I'm doing. I'm obviously not helping you. I'm doing something. So he took it on himself. Stanley had a kind of pixie-ish sense of humor, but his demeanor on the set, quiet, very quiet man. And the quietness that came out of certainty. And I remember overhearing a crew member say to another crew member, probably at the end of a long day and tired and so on, and he said to the other guy, he says, you know what? He says, you know what gets me all riled up? He says, the bloody bastard's always right.
For Kubrick, the most critical element of his and Clark's story would be their bold handling of the film's climactic alien encounter. Here at last, the director knew he could give his imagination free rein, confident that no empirical evidence existed yet that would challenge his movie speculations. He had no idea of the surprise that was coming. As 2001 was nearing completion, Stanley Kubrick was in a race with reality. He knew the accelerated pace of NASA's Apollo program would soon place humans on the surface of the moon, possibly even before his film opened. But there was one moment in mankind's near future he felt sure he would get to first. The signal event their story had been building towards literally for millions of years. First contact with an alien intelligence. And then one day, Stanley Kubrick got some news.
There have been a few times when we've actually thought we've made radio contact with extraterrestrial civilizations. The first time was something that got dubbed LGM-1, which is Little Green Men 1. It was a radio source found with a radio telescope that was a regular rhythmic pulsing. And a lot of people, including Stanley Kubrick, went absolutely nuts. They thought, hey, we've really got the aliens here. We have made contact.
Nobody dreamed of pulsars until they were discovered. That's true of almost all the important discoveries in astronomy.
When a large star ends its life in a massive supernova explosion, it collapses under gravity into a dense core of solid neutron matter, spinning rapidly and sweeping the sky like a powerful radio beacon.
And you get what is in essence a lighthouse effect, a beam of radio energy going back and forth across the sky, and when it happens to go across your line of sight, your radio telescope, you pick up a beep, and it looks exactly like what you would think an artificial beacon set up by an alien civilization would appear as to a radio telescope.
The universe is so huge and we've explored so little of it. So there's no doubt there are all kinds of interesting things out there we haven't yet imagined. Every time you look at a new object in the sky, it turns out to be unexpectedly complicated.
In 2001, unexpected complications also arise from the best of human intentions, a regular theme in Stanley Kubrick's work. And if the intervening years have taught us anything, it's the true frustration that can only be experienced by staring into the enigmatic face of our latest helper and possible replacement, the computer.
Well, gentlemen, this is the computer itself.
The frightening prospect of science left uncontrolled to accidentally create our own successors has been around for centuries. Still, the possibility of a supercomputer like HAL 9000 carries an even darker resonance. Perhaps because, unlike the earlier monsters of science fiction, this one may soon be among us.
Open the pod bay doors, please, Hal.
We anticipate the day, maybe 10 to 20 years from now, and we will have a HAL, a safe HAL. But it is on the NASA drawing boards. We are working on it at NASA Ames. It is not science fiction.
I believe the general opinion among the artificial intelligentsia is that HAL's round about 2020. And beyond that, you know, we'll have super HALs, and what happens to us at that stage is a matter of considerable debate. Will they treat us nicely?
Gödel, I believe in the 30s, established that all formal systems end up with paradoxes. And this is what faced HAL. He had two sets of mission directives, and these came into conflict. And he could not resolve them. So he got rid of one of the mission directives. The reason he did that is because he lacked emotion. He was essentially a perfect intellect. Something that we are going to face when we start building artificial intelligence is that the first few are probably going to end up being sociopaths, just like HAL.
I guess 2001 is a murder mystery in some ways. I'm against violence in movies, but I must admit that we had a certain amount of violence in 2001.
The struggle for control that erupted between HAL and his human companions was never fully explained in Kubrick's film. Arthur Clarke's novel suggests a fundamental programming conflict, but the topic is still debated today as author Rob Sawyer offers one possible interpretation.
There's a lot of thought in artificial intelligence communities that the job of mankind really is to create its own successor, that we exist solely to create the silicon generation that will follow us. The new order will be a mechanical, electronic kind of life, and our job is to actually manufacture our successors. The film is very much about the quantum leap to a new level of existence. And I think HAL was conscious of the fact that what was really important was not for a human being to go find the monolith makers. It was really important for humanity's child, humanity's spawn, for artificial intelligence to go and touch the face of God. And I think that's a valid reading of the film in light of today's thoughts about artificial intelligence.
It's an argument that fits in well with Kubrick's often repeated themes in 2001's central and recurring conflict, the one between human technology and the human soul. Still, the idea that computers would guide humanity on journeys far from home has come true many times over. In the decades since the release of 2001, robotic missions with names like Viking, Voyager, and Galileo continue to conduct public tours of places we may one day visit in person. And as the world shares in these encounters, we're often reminded that this is still the safest way to travel.
Planetary exploration is unforgiving. You make one mistake out there, and it's a disaster. You know, people have, I think people accept that sense of danger and excitement. What we're doing is not easy. I mean, basically, we're talking about going to the frontier. Today's frontier is 3.5 billion miles from Earth. Like it or not, that's where it is, and it's difficult. And that's the lesson we learn.
In fact, the ultimate frontier in 2001 was much more than a destination, a journey under alien control, realized through Douglas Trumbull's own evolutionary breakthrough, a modification of a process known as slit scan photography. Predating today's computer imagery, long machine-controlled exposures allowed a moving slit to stretch flat artwork out onto each single frame of film. The journey through the alien Stargate remains the most controversial part of the movie. Coming as it did after 2 hours of grand spectacle, this assault of Einsteinian accelerations and alien landscapes demanded rapt attention, but would truly reward only careful, later contemplation. At the time, audiences and critics were torn in their response. Few fully understood just what they were looking at, which may have been the very impact Kubrick was hoping for.
When one person, Dave Bowman, goes through the Stargate as the emissary representing all of humankind, the novel and the movie really does what science fiction does best of all. It becomes transcendent. It starts dealing with things beyond normal human experience. And what Clarke and Kubrick gave us were aliens that really were worthy of that name, alien. They were beyond our comprehension.
Many people read far more into the movie than we thought was there, but they may be right. At one time, we shot a lot of narration to explain what was going on. Stanley and I went all sorts of blind alleys, and I wrote a whole book called The Lost Worlds of 2001, which has now been reissued, describing some of the films we might have made and some of the ideas we might have developed, most of which we were really glad we discarded.
Stanley always felt the movie should speak for itself. You know, he never tried, ever explained what anything meant.
I remember hearing that in San Francisco, someone who was probably under the influence of some strange weed ran down the aisle yelling, "It's God, it's God," and disappeared through the screen.
You don't get the impact of it if you watch it on TV or on a video. You have to see it on that big screen to understand.
It's difficult, if not impossible, to make a movie these days like 2001. I mean, Kubrick was a one-off. There are no other directors like Stanley Kubrick on the field today.
The 1968 release of 2001, A Space Odyssey, heralded an age of growth and adventure that hasn't quite materialized yet. The film's climax saw humanity evolving towards a higher level of existence, even as the real future we've landed in finds us struggling to maintain a working hold on low Earth orbit. But the film remains a vision of progress and hope. And in looking back, we may conclude that the still do now.
A society that doesn't know how to dream is a society that can't set goals.
I mean, who would have thought that 30 years after the moon landings, we don't have a base on the moon? Who would have thought we don't even have the capability to go to the moon?
If there was one humbling lesson for science fiction people in the last